Good evening, I'm Laura Lee.
And I'm Dan Wolf. Thanks for joining us. Conversations on Capitol Hill are ongoing tonight as the government faces a potential shutdown this weekend. Now, if the government does shut down, millions of federal workers and military personnel, they're going to lose their paychecks. Essential workers and TSA employees will have to work without pay, and some food programs relying on federal aid will stop.
Northern News Now's Natalie Hepner explains how thousands of people in the Northland could be impacted. Natalie?
Yeah, Dan and Laura, the federal government will run out of funding by October 1st, and that shutdown will happen if there isn't a deal by that time. Some of the programs that would be slashed includes food assistance services across the nation. Government funding supports national food programs like WIC and SNAP. WIC offers healthy food to low-income moms along with children up to 5 years old. SNAP provides food benefits to low-income families. In Minnesota, almost 100,000 moms and children used WIC last year alone. In Wisconsin, that number is more than 130,000. If a federal government shutdown does happen, the White House wouldn't be able to fund WIC, terminating the program.
That's critically important. Allows moms to have both high-value infant formula and also fruits and vegetables for their children. That program would stop with a shutdown, and those folks would ultimately not get the benefit of that nutrition assistance.
According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, nearly 7 million moms and young children use that program nationwide. WIC also serves about half of all infants born in the United States. If the potential shutdown lasts long enough, SNAP could be impacted too. USDA says the program would continue as normal through October. Tonight we'll hear from a Duluth food shelf about their concerns if federal dollars stop, and we'll have their reaction tonight at 10.